Welcome to Wednesdays at the John Hope Franklin Center for Interdisciplinary and International Studies. The Franklin Center honors the legacy of Professor John Hope Franklin, the former James B. Duke Professor of History and Legal History at Duke University. John Hope Franklin accumulated a number of distinctions and awards as one of America's most accomplished historians. His 1947 study of the African-American experience from slavery to freedom remains among the most notable and widely read works in the field. The newly updated 10th edition was published in 2021. Welcome to today's event, Defining and Measuring Research Impact in the Humanities. My name is Heidi Madden, and I'm the head of International and Area Studies at Duke University Libraries. I organized this event together with my colleagues in International and Area Studies at Duke University Libraries, and in collaboration with Paolo Mangiafico, who will introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Paolo Mangiafico. I'm a scholarly communication strategist in Duke Libraries and co-director of a center in the library called ScholarWorks, which aims to help members of the Duke community to disseminate their research in more open and equitable ways, understand things like metrics, and in general kind of help reform scholarship in ways that are more open and equitable. And I'm glad to see you all here.
The idea for this event came after we read a blog at Duke entitled Duke's Most Cited, the Scholars Other Scientists Look to. Metrics tools are firmly established in the sciences, but they are not designed to capture the impact of humanities research. The article was naturally scoped to the sciences, and the Duke Humanities scholars asked librarians what equivalent tools, if any, are available for the humanities. I am so happy to welcome Heather Coates to address this question for us. Heather Coates is the Digital Scholarship and Data Management Librarian at the University Library Center for Digital Scholarship at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, the Joint School of Professional Degrees. At the University Library, she coordinates research data services and research metrics services to support faculty success in research and career advancement. As an open research advocate, she cares deeply about the integrity, accessibility, and sustainability of the scholarly record as a public good, and she is dedicated to promoting more equitable research evaluation practices in higher education. Please feel free to post questions in chat as they occur to you as you listen to the presentation. When the presentation is over, we will have a Q&A with the opportunity to raise your hand and speak in person. Heather will share her slides after the event. Heather, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Heidi and Paolo, for inviting me to speak today. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to a great discussion. So let's dive in. So our roadmap for today is on the slide here. And to establish some common ground, I want to take the first 15 minutes or so to explore how the data that are used to derive metrics are generated and to consider implications for the metrics themselves. Then we'll talk about using metrics in different research evaluation processes. And finally, I'll share how we're implementing practices for using metrics responsibly at my library. So all metrics are numbers, but how are they generated? Where does the data come from? That's what we're going to explore in this section. So first, I want to clarify some of the terminology that I'll use throughout this presentation and the conversation. I typically talk about metrics using two broad categories. One is based on the objects that the metrics are about. So is it about a venue such as a journal? Is it about a product such as an article, a book chapter, etc.? Or is it the metric about authors? The other way that I talk about metrics and that we see more often in the literature is types based on the data. So where does the data come from? So generally this This is primarily centered on citations. And more recently, we have the language around altmetrics. And the agreement on what these things mean is a little bit more fuzzy here. But the scientometricians, bibliometricians, the statisticians who specialize in these areas often break that down into web metrics or webometrics and social media metrics. So metrics derived from social media platforms. So you're going to hear these terms and I'll try to be consistent, but oftentimes language is one of the places where we have sort of looseness and confusion, and that's one of the issues we'll talk about a little bit. So this diagram here is a very informal attempt to visualize how metrics data are generated. So in the yellow oval, we have scholarly products such as articles, books and chapters, conference presentations and papers, as well as data and code. And we engage with these products within the networked environment using a variety of tools through news and media coverage, through social media platforms and internet browsers. We can save, bookmark, and annotate these products using tools like Zotero, Mendeley, CiteYouLike, and Hypothesis, and others. And then finally, we have the metrics aggregators on the bottom right that include companies like Digital Science, Clarivate Analytics, and Elsevier. They harvest the digital traces of the activities, of the interactions we have with the scholarly products, and they use those to calculate the metrics. So this is another sort of maybe simpler but alternative view of this idea of how metrics data are generated. So the products we create exist in this online environment where we can interact with them in various ways. We can view, download, bookmark, like, share, discuss, etc. And then these activities leave digital traces and are aggregated and counted generally to create indicators. And here's another important term to sort of be aware of. In the metrics literature, metrics are called indicators because they are proxies. They are not direct measures for concepts. So keep that sort of looseness and that distance in mind. They are not directly measuring quality or impact, or some of the terms that we often use when we're talking about research. And in the case of citation metrics, we tend to have more mathematically sophisticated metrics that are based on decades of research experience and our understanding of how citation metrics differ between different fields and disciplines, countries, et cetera. In the case of altmetrics, we don't yet have those sophisticated metrics because we don't yet have the evidence to create them. Okay, so this image is of the Open Citations data model, and I'm not asking you to interpret or sort of make sense of it, but it is a metadata model used for the data stored in the Open Citations dataset, which is a great initiative to make citation data open, to get it out of proprietary systems that are owned by the big publishers. But as you can see here, making accurate and reliable connections between products, activities, and users is quite difficult. It's time consuming and resource intensive. So I'd like to ask you just to take a minute to think about everything that needs to work in order for a citation to a publication to be counted, for a view or a download of a publication to be counted, for a blog or Wikipedia or policy mention of a publication to be counted. Okay, so metadata is what enables many of the connections necessary for the retrieval and the calculation of the indicators that we call metrics. But we know that many places underinvest in the creation of high quality metadata or are under-resourced. So keep that in mind as we talk about the limitations and biases of metrics. So the data that we use to create metrics are not neutral. Like all systems created by humans, the publishing ecosystem contains inequities. I think this is probably obvious to all of us. There are many opportunities for introducing bias. So consider who is able to conduct research and creative activities? Who's able to find an appropriate venue for publishing their work? Who's able, or what types of publishers have the resources to make products discoverable and accessible, again, through that metadata? Which venues are indexed in citation databases or by scholarly search engines, et cetera. So we have a really deep set of literature about biases in citation databases, and there are well-documented, there's well-documented evidence for bias in coverage, language, geography, field of research, and genre. So I have in the slides, I have a couple of articles if you're interested in diving into this further that you might want to take a look at. But the key point here is that metrics are only as good as the underlying data used to derive them. So if we look at some of the key tools that are used to produce articles, like the one about high impact research at Duke or in my own institution, we can see that there are vast differences, substantial differences. So metrics are also shaped by the selection of items that are included in these tools. Most often we get metrics from Web of Science, Scopus, and Dimensions. If we look at Web of Science, which its intent, its expressed intent is to be selective, we can see that the coverage is relatively limited. There's only 13,000+ journals, and particularly relevant for this audience, only 6.7% of the content is classified using their subject categories as social sciences, and only 1.3% is arts and humanities. If we look at Scopus, there's a much broader coverage of the literature. Their book coverage is a little bit better. They have lots of book chapters, but the domain coverage is still underrepresented. So 8.7% of content for social sciences and 2.7% for arts and humanities. Dimensions is another citation tool. I hesitate to call it a database because it's built in a slightly different way, and it has broader information in it than just citations. It has patent information, clinical guidelines, et cetera. But my institution does not have a subscription, so we use what's freely available, which tends to be the citation piece. So Dimensions has broader coverage, but if we look at these numbers, there's still probably underrepresentation. So one of the other interesting things about these citation databases is that it's really difficult to compare them directly because they each use a different classification schema for their subject headings or their fields of research. But this gives you a general sense for how much is in there at a very, very high level. So for altmetrics, we don't have quite the same level of detail or understanding since the social media platforms and the web technologies that they're derived from are much newer. The research just we haven't gotten there yet. But what we do know are that there are 3 key challenges in altmetric data identified by Stephanie Haustein in this a really excellent 2016 article. The heterogeneity means that the data sources or the metrics that are considered altmetrics are not equivalent. So a tweet is not the same thing as a share on Facebook, is not the same thing as a policy mention or a Wikipedia mention. Or at least at this point, we don't have the evidence to indicate that they're equivalent. Additionally, there are massive data quality issues, and the data themselves are highly dependent on the platforms from which they are derived. And we know these platforms are not, scholarly dissemination and publishing is not their primary purpose. So there are many things that the scholars are still trying to understand. Finally, the reliability across the different sources of altmetrics data is low to moderate, depending on both the metric itself and the aggregator. And this article by Zora Zahedi and Rodrigo Costas from 2018 does a really excellent job of describing that. If you're interested, it's all in the references at the end of the slides. So this is a broad and slightly outdated view from 2018 about the coverage for the three key sources for altmetric data. So there's altmetric.com, which has the broadest range of altmetric activities. It has sort of much better coverage around Twitter activity, media coverage because of their arrangements to get data from other media outlets, and blog mentions. Whereas PlumX does a much better job of capturing Mendeley readers, in part because they are owned by Elsevier now, and so is Mendeley. And has broader coverage than Crossref event data. Now, at the time of this study, Crossref event data was still in beta, but it is essentially capturing activities, those activities and interactions that I mentioned earlier, based on the publications or the products that are in their very massive database or system. So Crossref is used to mint DOIs and facilitates a lot of the scholarly publishing that happens. However, Crossref is not a metrics service provider. So you can get the data from their API, but you have to process it yourself. So we're still sort of trying to get a sense for how did the data differ from these different platforms. Okay. Some other key things to know, and I've selected some of the sort of key standout ways in which bibliometrics data, so data derived from information about publications or books, the ways in which they are non-normal. There are many other really interesting phenomena, but these I think speak to the conversation today. So there's Lotka's law, which says about 20% of researchers produced 80% of published documents. Bradford's law describes that the majority of citations are received by relatively few journals, and this is a specific instance of the Pareto distribution, the 80-20. And then we have the Matthew effect, so which states that recognition is more likely to be given to those who already have high degrees of recognition. And this is essentially the citation equivalent of the rich get richer. So being cited makes your work more visible, which means that you're more likely to get cited again. A virtuous cycle sort of plays into account. And there are many factors associated with that. There's a relatively, there's some really interesting articles about that. Okay, so let's take some time to explore how what we know about the data and the implications for the metrics themselves. So in general, both community norms, so human practice, and technical choices on the part of altmetrics aggregators influence the validity of metrics for any particular product, metric, and field. And one of the key principles of citation analysis that comes out of the scholars, the statisticians who study this, is that you do not compare citation metrics for different disciplines, because there are differences in citation density that are shaped by the norms and the practices of the field. So for example, we wouldn't expect the amount of citations for a small interdisciplinary field to be as high, or maybe to accrue as quickly as we might for pediatrics and medicine, because the number of scholars, the pace of research, probably the funding that influences how much and how fast publishing happens differs. So a particular interesting and well covered metric that I think highlights some of these issues is the journal impact factor. The journal impact factor is a publication metric that reflects the annual average or mean number of citations to articles published in a particular journal. So for example, a 2018 journal impact factor reflects citations to articles published in 2016 and 2017, but the citations accrued in 2018, which I believe is incredibly counterintuitive. Callaway demonstrated in a really, I think, interesting and provocative piece that the majority, anywhere from 65 to 75% of articles that are published in a journal receive fewer citations than you would expect based on the journal impact factor. So if a GIF, which is my acronym for it, is 34.7, you can see here the majority of papers receive fewer citations than 34. Very few papers receive more, and you can see that that mean is highly influenced by these outliers, the few papers that receive extremely high numbers of citations. So this is, a numbers statistical thing, but it influences people's behavior. So the co-option, this quote is from an excellent article by Vincent Lariviere and some other folks, and states the co-option of journal impact factors as a tool for assessing individual articles and their authors, a task for which they were never intended, is a deeply embedded problem in academia. And people have hypothesized all sorts of reasons for ways in which the journal impact factor chasing perverts publishing. For example, if you seek to publish in a high impact journal, you might be submitting to a journal that's not the best fit. It delays your publication timeline. You may get rejected, and then you may be looking at other journals. And so it changes people's behavior in ways that are detrimental to their careers, but also something important to know is that the journal impact factor was not developed to evaluate individual articles. It was developed to help librarians with collection development, i.e. which journals to purchase. So these graphs also sort of demonstrate how skewed the distribution of citations is, and another way in which the data are non-normal. The bibliometrics data are super weird in lots of interesting ways that have impact for metrics. We also know from the literature that the unit of analysis matters. So while the bibliometric data might be robust enough to conduct studies of national or disciplinary patterns, there may be gaps that affect the validity of that same data to analyze disciplines or programs or institutions. And this is particularly true for data at the level of individuals. In fact, many bibliometricians caution against using metrics to evaluate individuals. These are the statisticians who know the data well, and they recommend lots of caution and careful use. So that's something that we'll be talking about later. So based on the metrics literature, the evidence suggests that social sciences and humanities research, which you can argue whether we should be grouping these different very broad domains together, but that social science and humanities research differs from science in the following ways. So it tends to have a stronger national and regional orientation, as evidenced by the language in which folks are publishing and the journals that they're publishing in. The literature is published less in journals and more in books, has a slower pace of theoretical development. That tends to have less, I think, implication for metrics, but I thought it was an interesting result, and you might argue with that. It tends to be less collaborative, although many of the studies around that are a few years old, and I believe that is changing over time. So it would be interesting to see how that shifts over the next 10 to 15 years. social science and humanities research is directed more often at a non-scholarly public. And so this influences the metrics that we have, because many national and regional journals are not covered by Web of Science, which again, remember, aims to be selective and generally focuses on journals that have international levels of audiences. We also know that the Web of Science citation database overrepresents English language, social science and humanities journals by 20 to 25%. So if you're working with folks or you are publishing in another language, this is another bias, right? And book coverage in Web of Science is very, very limited. This has changed over time, but again, if you remember the comparison between Web of Science, Scopus, and Dimensions, it's definitely not the place to look for information about books. Okay, so one of the reasons that I was asked to speak to you today is because I'm one of the co-founders of the Metrics Toolkit. And so I'm going to show you a quick demo of our new in progress Metrics Toolkit 2.0. We are in the process of updating it, partly to migrate to a new tech platform, partly to implement a new schema that we hope will be more simple and user-friendly for folks who are new to metrics, and to incorporate the latest round of evidence reviews, literature reviews, to update the posts. So I'm just going to show you very, very briefly. And the reason that we created this tool, which is free, by the way, is it's unreasonable, it's unrealistic for people who are not bibliometric scholars or altmetric scholars to remember all the nuances and the limitations when they are doing work that requires them to think about research products, research evaluation, scholarly communication. So we wanted to create an evidence-based resource that was not vendor, that was not influenced by trying to sell any particular vendor platform, and that translated what is fairly technically complex literature into more user-friendly language. So we have this new schema that we developed that simplifies the posts into sections called what it is, how it works, what to keep in mind, and then sometimes we'll have places where you can learn more. Often these are layman's blog posts or more simplified description of things. And then we have cross-linking between the metrics posts for related metrics. We also are developing and building out a how to use the metrics toolkit for folks who maybe don't have the same level of context, early career researchers, folks who are coming from industry, to help give them some context for the posts and how to interpret them, and what the sort of limitations and expectations are. This is definitely still in development, but we hope that it will help folks navigate the site more easily. And then finally, we're going to have different ways of sort of grouping and navigating these, but we have these updated posts based on the new schema. And where possible, of course, we're pointing to open access versions of literature and trying to be as transparent as possible about where the evidence is coming from, as well as where things were last updated. So that is the Metrics Toolkit version 2.0. We very much hope that it will be launched in the next month or so. It's been a spring, so we're a little bit behind where we would like to be. Okay. So let's take a big deep breath. And now we're going to dive into metrics in the context of research evaluation. So when we talk about research, we often use concepts or terms like research excellence, impact, and prestige. But it's rare that these concepts are operationalized sufficiently for us to actually evaluate them consistently and accurately. So take a moment to think about one of these terms, pick one. How does it show up? When does it begin to appear? Where do we look for it? How do we know it when we see it? And how do we measure that? Is the answer to those questions rooted in metrics? Or are metrics the first place you think of to start? So sit with that for a minute, and we're going to talk through some tools. So two tools that we use and recommend to our faculty that help them unpack these ideas, especially impact and excellence, and help move them towards a more shared understanding and set of terms that we can communicate about, are the Becker model for research assessment, which breaks down impact into 5 categories. We are a health sciences campus, but we have a lot of folks who don't necessarily do biomedical stuff. So we tend to take the clinical implementation facet or dimension and turn it into what's something that is locally relevant for IUPUI, which is translating research into practice. And I do that all the time in my work. Many of us who are professionals or in the social sciences, we are both scholars and practitioners. And so that's an area where we can think about how do we take research or creative activity and apply it in everyday work. Community benefit, economic benefit, and legislation and policy. It can be an incredibly helpful tool as a starting point for unpacking what types of impact scholars are aiming for in their work, particularly when we start these conversations early on in the tenure process or early on in their promotion timeline. If they don't all resonate for you, that is totally fine. Think about what does. Think about the kinds of impact, whatever the label is. Think about who is it that you're trying to affect? What kinds of outcomes do you want to see? These are all very much influenced by program evaluation practices and theories. So the other tool that we often refer people to is the iNorms Research Evaluation Working Group. It's from the UK. They came up with a scope process that provides guidance for groups or units to reconsider how research evaluation is embedded into various processes like P&T, promotion and tenure. The scope principles are rooted in the scope process is rooted in 3 principles, which I think are great. One is that you evaluate only where necessary. Evaluation is not always the right strategy. 2, you evaluate with the evaluated. Any evaluation should be co-designed and co-interpreted by the communities being evaluated. And 3, draw on evaluation expertise. We should apply the same rigor to our evaluations that we apply to our academic research. And we know that these things are not often happening in promotion and tenure, hiring, et cetera. But these are excellent tools. I highly recommend that you go take a look at them, particularly the scope process, for furthering the conversation about how do we actually come up with evidence that speaks to the things that we care about. This is a brief extract from the Becker model of the types of evidence that might be available to demonstrate the 5 types of impact that they articulate. So for advancement of knowledge, it's publications, but it might also be collaborations, materials, methods or tools, et cetera. We use this as a starting point to encourage candidates, reviewers, and administrators to broaden their perspective on the range of potential evidence that might be used to demonstrate impact in a promotion and tenure dossier. So I'm not going to read all of this to you. I highly recommend that you take a look at the Becker model if you are interested in broadening the conversation. So we know that models for producing scholarship differ by nations, disciplines, research methods, communities. And we have to be careful when we're comparing publications or people. So we have adopted these sort of strategies or this advice that we provide, again, to candidates, reviewers, administrators about metrics in the promotion and tenure process. So metrics, again, are indicators. They're not direct measures. They are not a substitute for evaluating quality. No metric speaks to quality that I'm aware of. And quality is best evaluated by peer review, by someone who understands the context in which the research was generated. We encourage folks to use normalized metrics when they are available. And what I mean by normalized metrics are, they are metrics that have been statistically adjusted to compare like to like. So normally these are adjusted based on by field or discipline, publication year or time frame, sometimes it's shorter than a year, and by the type of article. So for example, you don't compare original research articles to review articles. We strongly recommend that people use metrics alongside qualitative evidence and provide context whenever possible about the metrics themselves so that they understand the relative validity and relevance of those metrics to the person's case or research products. When we speak to candidates about using metrics, we highly encourage them to not structure their case around the metrics. The metrics are evidence to support the case, but they should not drive someone's case for promotion and tenure. And more broadly, and this may or may not sort of generalize depending on your dossier structure and institutional guidelines, but when people are talking about their research, we encourage them to organize it based on their research areas and then integrate the products that are generated within each of those areas, and then build the evidence, link the metrics and the other kinds of evidence into that sort of overall framework to demonstrate that the metrics are one source of evidence that can lend credibility or validity or substantiate claims of attention or use or impact, but they're not the meat of the case. So on the right, we have sort of guidance that we provide or advice we provide about where they include metrics and how they include metrics in the different pieces of our dossier. Again, this may not generalize, but we try to help them understand where the metrics should fit into the actual dossier itself. Similarly, so when we are evaluating research and creative activity for awards and other kinds of honors, there are some elements that are consistent with promotion and tenure, although it tends to be a little bit less complex. Oftentimes there are particular criteria, so we encourage candidates and reviewers to be sure that they understand what the criteria for evaluation are. For candidates, we recommend that they choose the most compelling and relevant evidence. This is not the time to throw all the stuff that you have. It's about cherry picking the best and most relevant. And again, we encourage folks to use a mix of qualitative and quantitative evidence, so story and numbers, because humans respond well to both. We like a combination. And finally, we find that sometimes folks overcomplicate the narrative and over-explain the metrics. And what we try to help them do is to make it as easy as possible for reviewers or for whomever is going to be looking at this to connect the evidence and the criteria. And sometimes you just have to state that very explicitly. Excuse me. So research development professionals are hugely important at most of our institutions, and they serve a key function in making visible the research and creative activities happening at our institutions. But many of them don't have expertise in scholarly publishing or research metrics, but they're still using metrics-based tools. So we're still trying to understand how to support this kind of work at IUPUI, and I have more questions than advice. But again, here you'll see some parallels. Metrics should support but not drive this work. So we don't want to just choose to brag about a scholar who has the most highly cited works in his school, because that's only going to give us one very narrow perspective on impact or quality or prestige or success. So we hope that we can provide a broader perspective on how can research development recognize and celebrate all the great things that are happening, match potential collaborators with funding opportunities, and communicate the value of research to the public in a way that looks beyond the typical easy things to count, like grant dollars, publications, citations. So this is something I've been thinking a lot about. How do we celebrate the kinds of scholarship and the kinds of scholars who are often invisible or whose work takes decades to be seen or be appreciated? How can we work with, how can libraries and research development partner to advance a culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, access, belonging, justice at our institutions? So, I mean, the easy conclusion is that metrics are not the only evidence, right? They're only one form of evidence. Some of the most important changes we want to see are very difficult or resource intensive to measure, and some may not happen for decades. We just may not know. So we encourage people to think about, how would you document or gather evidence to demonstrate adoption of your theory or model or instrument by practitioners? How would you document reuse of your course materials? How do you evidence that there's been significant public engagement with your program? And this often gets us towards program evaluation, right? Where we can potentially plan for direct measures of outcomes. And we're not relying so much on these metrics that are easily available, but less relevant and valid in many, many cases. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk through is how we use metrics responsibly. And then we'll get through this in 2 minutes, and then we'll have lots of time for questions. So at my institution, we have been formalizing this service since we started it in about 2013. We've been formalizing it since 2017. We have a service philosophy where we try to outline our view on metrics and their place in this work. We try to be very clear about what is our goal. So we want scholars to get credit for all the work that they do to make the invisible more visible, to make the connection between the inequities and gaps in the current systems and the specific practices that we're recommending, to articulate that and help people understand this is why we're doing it in a particular way. We try to help them understand where there are gaps and less evidence so that they can provide additional support to folks who are disadvantaged by the metrics ecosystem. So here's some information about our service. You can go and look and explore this later. On these slides, these are really just for reference. We have adopted or really been influenced by both the Leiden Manifesto and the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessments. And we try to take those principles and put them into concrete practice. So for example, measuring performance against the research missions of the institution, group, or researcher, this is one of the reasons we use the Becker model to help folks understand and articulate, these are the kinds of impact that I'm trying to accomplish, and these are the kinds of evidence that speak to that impact when it shows up. I'm not going to read through all of these. We also have this for the Declaration of Research Assessment. One of the things that we have taken, I think, a pretty hard stance on is advocating for people to stop using the journal impact factor. We have a policy brief that you can read if you're interested. We know that it's not going to stop all at once, so we provide some soft middle options of, if you must, please do it in this way. But the whole point is that we want to measure what matters instead of valuing what we can measure. And this is where I've been super strongly influenced by the HuMetricsHSS initiative and the article by Nikki Agate and team. It's in the references. I highly recommend you go read it. It's called The Transformative Power of Values Enacted Scholarship. So here's some food for thought. Some possible next steps. And I'm going to stop talking now.
Thank you, Heather. You've given us quite a lot to think about. So we have about 15 minutes for questions and discussion. And so there are two ways you can ask your questions. One is to put them in the chat, and then I'll read them out, and we can have a discussion about that. Or if you'd like to ask your question by voice, use the raise hand function under the reactions button in Zoom, and then we'll call on people to unmute yourself and ask your question. So I saw there were a couple of questions already in the chat earlier, so I'm gonna start with those, and then everyone else, you can get into the discussion too. So Liz asked, thinking about the tendency of social science and humanities scholarship to be directed more at non-scholarly public, for example, through podcasts, websites, community engagement, popular media, etc., and also about the MLA's recent guidelines for public scholarship. What guidance would you offer to how to track and measure one's research impact when scholarly work is shared through these non-traditional forms for not necessarily scholarly audiences?
Yeah, so we have a number of folks at our campus, and so there's a couple of answers to this. One is the relatively, well, anyway, so if you have a podcast, you have a website, put Google Analytics or another maybe less problematic web analytics tool in place, because it will give you information that you can use to shape your promotion, your outreach, but also give you evidence when you are going up for promotion and tenure or applying for awards or whatever. The other thing that you can do, again, to capture that story piece is make it easy for people to share their anecdotes with you. Ask them to send a note of appreciation or invite them and turn it into a conversation and a dialogue. You just have to know your audience to do that. And there are folks who do this much, much better than I do. But a lot of it just comes down to knowing your audience and having ways to capture the impact that you care about and the stories.
Yeah, just add on that one thought that there's I've heard this term anecdata, which is used kind of disparagingly, but also can be used to to, like you said, to craft a story. There's that saying of like picture's worth 1,000 words, and I think a good story is worth 1,000 data points. So I agree with that. Yeah. There was another comment earlier in the chat from Jemica, referencing when you were talking about prestige, and saying rather than the individual author's publication, I look at where the author's work has been cited. So I guess who was the publisher? So could you reflect on that, or Jemica, if you want to unmute and kind of elaborate on the question, we can talk about that.
Sure. Hey, Heather.
Hi, Jemica.
Hi. So right now I'm working on a case, and this is a social science type person. So I'm seeing a lot of regional journals and book publishings. And so one of the things I thought to cite was where this person's scholarship has been cited. So not just the journals, but just also the quality of the journals. So that kind of blending of quartile rank with the fact that, hey, this is showing the spread of the author's work is kind of more what I was getting at. Very specifically to show the spread, and also to be able to talk to that issue of prestige, right?
Yes. Yeah. And I struggle with prestige a little bit because it means different things to different people. I do think that pointing to and I actually kind of consider this qualitative, it's descriptive data, where someone's work is being cited, whether it's the journal or the country affiliation of the first author or the institution, that absolutely can speak to prestige if we understand what prestige means. But I do think that pointing to that other kinds of evidence can help folks make more particular or more specific case for, my work is highly interdisciplinary. I'm influencing sociologists and anthropologists and demographers, and it's evidenced by, you know, my work's being cited in these places. Yeah, I think maybe it's because of my background, but I struggle with operationalizing prestige. But if you have the content knowledge and you know the presses, and you can speak to that as an external reviewer, you can absolutely do that. But as someone who's helping a candidate, and if I don't know their area, I don't feel comfortable speaking to prestige usually, if that makes any sense.
Sure, yeah.
But thank you for pointing. I mean, I think that's a really good, it kind of gets at the roles of different, the different roles in research evaluation. Department chairs have a different role than maybe an associate dean or a dean, than the peers, than the external reviewers.
And that kind of cross-disciplinary thing gets complicated. I remember hearing from, you know, on an APT committee, a mathematician saying, look, I'm being asked to evaluate this person who's in music, and I have no idea of how to assess that. And
Yeah.
Please help me. And so the numbers are kind of something that everyone goes to because they're like, a number's real, right? It feels like, yeah. The other thing that I was just reflecting on something you just said was that, you know, in the humanities, I think probably we understand the reputation of presses and university presses more and can kind of know which are the prestigious ones and not. And in STEM fields, you know, I don't know, I'm just speculating here, we outsource more of that to big companies like Web of Science. And there was this recent incident, maybe isn't the right word for it, a few weeks ago, where Web of Science delisted some publishers. Like MDPI and Frontiers, and suddenly anybody who had published in those journals from those publishers has lost their impact factor. And some universities are already saying, now we're not going to count anything you publish there. And that gives an awful lot of power to Clarivate and Web of Science to kind of regulate what they think is important. So I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit.
No, so yes, I agree. And I think this is the, whether you've heard this term or not, but I think the movement towards the scholarly community recapturing control over our scholarly infrastructure is hugely important. And I think that is one of the benefits of being in certain areas that are smaller, is that you do have that knowledge of, oh, this press is great for these areas. What I struggle with is, as someone who's helping faculty, researchers, whomever, and I come into that space, how do I understand that what you mean by prestige and this other person over here means by prestige is the same thing? Where's that common core? And like some social science areas will create rankings. So they'll like essentially create surveys to rank different journals. I don't know if that's done at all in the humanities, probably not, but how do we begin to formalize some of the knowledge about this so that when you have a math professor reviewing a history person's case, they can come to the conversation with the right information and not bring all their assumptions about math?
I think that the humanities, one of the downsides of us is that we're so diverse, right? So I'm a humanities librarian. My doctorate is in English. My specialization is 20th and 21st century African-American literature. So if I was still writing as a core faculty, there's a core set of small journals, very small journals that I would be expected to publish in if I was going to, like if we were talking about like having a first ranked journal, but we would all know what those are. And that would be about like 5 or maybe, 6. I think it's a kind of like that for other things where for in the humanities, at least, it can go down to, well, I'm doing this particular type of thing, and this is all the modernist journals. These are the other types of journals. So I don't necessarily know if you can make that one-to-one if someone is in mathematics. I think for that, that's where it becomes more about leaning into the other types of qualitative data, but also trying to make transparent, right? Not so much, this is what's considered top tier. I think the argument is, okay, this is more about quality, and that, I guess that's where where we go with prestige, but that's just me. I'm gonna stop talking now.
Thanks, Jamaica.
See a couple of hands raised, Heidi, and then after Heidi, David, and if others want to ask questions, raise your hand to get in the queue.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. It's just amazing for us in international and area studies that not only is this a problem for English-based disciplines, but we sometimes get questions about international reach, and with all the international collaborations, I'm wondering if that question comes to you. So for example, for Europe, we have the European Reference Index for the Humanities and Social Sciences, which basically is an enterprise to include journals that have certain qualitative how would I say that? So that they practices. They have peer review, they have an ISSN, they have people not just from one institution. So the journal gets proposed, and then the journal gets evaluated, and if it meets the criteria, it gets included in the index, and the index is also searchable. So it's called ERI Plus. So have you investigated whether there are tools like that in different world regions, or is that too far afield?
So we don't have access to it, and I don't have any experience with it. What I will say is that this comes back to the sort of proximity and the relevance question. So yes, speaking to where something gets published can be important information, but I think what's more relevant when we are evaluating individuals and their research is the work itself. So metrics can't speak to quality. Indexing can't speak to the quality of a particular article. What those indexes typically reflect are that certain processes are in place, but do we ever audit peer review? Do we ever know how? So I do think we have to have a mix of formal and informal knowledge. We have to have a mix of evidence about the particular product itself, whether it's an article or a book. The venue piece of it to me is a little bit, it's less relevant. Yes, it is the platform by which it's disseminated, but again, being in a good journal doesn't guarantee that an article is high quality or will be high impact. So I encourage folks to sort of take a step back and think about, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish with this work? Who am I trying to reach? And am I getting the message out to those folks? And then you think about what kinds of evidence might arise from that to speak to those kinds of things. And it's not gonna just be where you published in the journal rank and the citations. Hopefully it's a much bigger picture. Yeah, so that's my kind of like parallel or tangential answer to that.
Thanks. David, let's go to you next. Oh, you're still muted.
Hi, Paolo, thank you for that. Heather, I run an independent collaboratory that's Do and Think Tank, focusing on long-term planetary issues on a pluriversal platform. And so our work is not strictly academic. We work with academics and non-academics, poets, theoreticians, practitioners, activists, etc. One thing that I'm wondering about is how we make an account of our work to our stakeholders, including our board and supporters and such. We're about to launch our website. And as we are trying not to support the regime of surveillance, capitalism, and state, we are electing to have a website that does not track, that does not place cookies on people's computers and devices when they visit our site. The only thing that we would have is an account of how many visitors we have. Is that a mistake in your view?
I applaud the ethical approach. Yes, I don't think it's a mistake. I think it's a trade-off. And so, I mean, when I think about the level of complexity of the kinds of work that you're talking about, where you're running a center, you have a program, and your stakeholders are numerous, and you're trying to affect change in the real world, which is complicated. I come back to, do you have a program evaluation? Do you have you consulted, have you thought about how will we measure? What are we aiming for? And I'm not a program evaluator, but I've worked with some amazing folks and I'm huge advocates for them. We use metrics because we don't all have the capacity to do full high quality program evaluation. That's just my perspective. So it's additional work on top of, but in many ways, I think it needs to be a part of the work, because we have to make the case that the work that we're doing has value and is hopefully achieving the aims that we're trying to. So yeah, you're going to lose information. Do I think there are other ways to capture important evidence about the kinds of impact you're having? Yes. You're probably going to have less numbers to throw at people, but I mean, as someone who's very concerned about privacy, that's great.
I know we're a little over time, but I saw Aaron you had your hand up. If you still want to ask your question, maybe we'll go to that as the last question.
No worries. I think we can close. It's been a very generative conversation.
Right.
Yeah, Heather or Heidi, do you want to say any closing remarks or?
Oh, I just want to thank Heather, and I have to admit I had never heard that term DEI ABJ plus. Am I in the? Did you create that, or is that?
No. It's part of several groups that I'm a part of here, where we're looking at these broader issues, and I like the broader perspective on what are we really talking about when we talk about equity and access. Anyway, yeah, I think it's just more reflective.
Thank you.
But no, I did not coin it. Thank you all for such a great conversation and for such great thoughts. Keep thinking and talking to each other about this. This is how you change culture.
Yeah, and I'll just add that there was a task force at Duke in 2017, 2018 that did some work in this area as part of the last strategic planning cycle and issued a really good report about reforming the APT process here at Duke to include some of the things that Heather talked about today. So if you're interested in that, if you go on the Duke Strategic Plan website and look for the task forces, you'll see the report from that task force from 2018. It's well worth a read.